Hi guys, welcome to chapter 3. So we are going to talk about genetics and prenatal development. We're probably going to split this into two separate videos. So this will be the genetics video, and then I'll talk about prenatal development next. So when we're talking about genetics, when I was a kid, they hadn't mapped the entire human genome, and it was such a big deal when they finally figured it out. We believed as soon as we knew the DNA, we'd be able to fix all the problems in the world, and there would be these designer babies, and you could program your kid with whatever eye color, hair color, intelligence, athletic ability. It was just like the sci-fi world of the future was opening for everybody. Turns out it's way more complicated than that. So we will talk about that as we go through this chapter. So the human body contains 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. Chromosomes are just DNA, which is raveled up really tight. If you unstrung the DNA in every single minuscule cell in the body, then you would unravel that DNA 6 feet long. That's how much DNA there is in every single cell in the body. It's pretty miraculous. So DNA, of course, is the coding for how to build a body and how to activate a body, how to use a body. So just like a computer, every computer program, all of this complicated software we use, it's all coded with zeros and ones. The DNA is way more complicated. It's coded with 4 different proteins. So it's not just zeros and ones. You've got 1, 2, 3, and 4, or 0, 1, 2, 3, however you want to look at it. So that means that we can have a lot more combinations and a lot more complexity than even computers, which are insanely complex. So that just tells you how complex the human body is. It's pretty amazing. So DNA is stored in genes, which contain coded instructions, and the chromosomes are full of genes. Basically, a gene is just like a section of DNA. We also call it a SNP. And that gene controls certain things. Some genes control one thing, some genes control lots of things. So we look at, when you have your DNA analyzed, which I've done, you should do too, it's pretty interesting. You can do that through like 23andMe, places like that. And it will tell you what your SNPs say for you. So like for instance, I have a SNP for red hair. Now that was not activated. Obviously I don't have red hair. I wish I did, but I don't. But I do have the possibility of a child with red hair because I contain a gene or a SNP for red hair, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that we'll get to that more later, where genes are not necessarily activated. So you could have genes for certain things that didn't get activated. We will get into that. The genome is the entire gamut of hereditary information in your body. So all of your DNA is what we call your genome. And by the way, you get when you're conceived, you got 23 pairs of chromosomes from dad, 23 pairs from mom. So this is just a picture of somebody's chromosomes right here. So you can see that they stick together in pairs. This is why we say like XX and XY for boys and girls, because of the very last chromosome, so this 23rd pair. In girls, it will be like 2 that kind of stick together, and for boys it's 2, but one of them is like really short. So it's in a Y shape rather than an X shape. And that determines whether it's a boy or a girl. And so on that chromosome, it contains a lot of information about like hormonal release and such. All right, anyhow, so I was talking about how you may have genes for certain things, but they don't get expressed. That's the difference between the genotype and the phenotype. So genotype is what is in your DNA. Phenotype is what parts of your DNA get expressed. For instance, you may have the genes for breast cancer, but you may never get breast cancer. So your genome has the potential, it has the DNA coding for breast cancer, but that doesn't mean that phenotypically it ever gets expressed, and hopefully it never does. If you do not have breast cancer in your genotype, you will never get breast cancer. It's not possible. Okay? Unless like, I don't know, radiation exposure, because that actually changes your DNA. Okay. So genotype is the individual's genes. Phenotype is the actual characteristics that get expressed. And the difference between your genotype and your phenotype is your environment. And that's why mapping the human genome didn't change all that much, because what we've realized is that the expression of the genes is much more complicated than just the fact that you have the genes. So you might have a gene for depression, which is more complicated than that, but we'll get into that in the next slide or so. But you may have a gene for depression, but you have a really decent life and it never gets triggered to be expressed. Or you go to war and now that gene for depression gets triggered and you have post-traumatic stress disorder. So now phenotypically you didn't have depression before, but phenotypically you do now. Okay, and that was influenced by the environment of whether the genotype got triggered, got expressed. It's also influenced by dominant recessive inheritance. So because we are inheriting pairs of chromosomes, generally speaking, the chromosomes have genes for the same things on both sides of it. So you have a gene for eye color from dad, you have a gene for eye color from mom. Now, some genes are dominant and some genes are recessive. If it is a dominant, then it overwhelms the recessive gene. So brown eye color is a dominant gene. So if you got brown eye color from dad and mom's blue eyes, so she gives you blue eye color, you're going to most likely be born with brown eyes because brown eyes are dominant. Now it gets a little bit more complicated than that because for eye color, you actually get 2 of each from mom and dad. So dad could be double dominant or he could be dominant and recessive. So that means that he has the genes for brown and blue eyes. So even though he's brown eyes, he could still have a gene for blue eyes. So if mom is blue eyes, that means she's double recessive for blue. She's blue-blue. So there is a chance that the child of that coupling could have blue eyes because you potentially could get the recessive from both parents. So yeah, it gets complicated. And some genes the inheritance is even more complicated than that. All right, so the dominant gene influences phenotype, although you may pass down recessive genes to your child so that they don't necessarily look like you. And then you can also have incomplete dominance. And we're not going to go into the complicated genetics of how that happens, but basically the dominant gene mostly takes control, but the recessive gene can sometimes poke in a little bit, and that's how like you get hazel colored eyes. So that's an incomplete dominance. That's a brown-eyed person who also has some green eye color coming into it. All right. So here's just some dominant and recessive traits. Now these are single gene traits, meaning one gene controls these things. Many things are polygenic, which means that it's like depression. That's why I'm saying it's more complicated than just having a gene for depression. There are multiple genes that control whether you can become depressed or not. But these traits are single gene traits, so there's just one gene involved. So curly hair is dominant. So curly and straight hair person have a baby, most likely will have curly hair. Dark hair is dominant. Facial dimples are dominant. Normal hearing is dominant. Deafness is recessive. Freckles are dominant. No freckles are recessive. Unattached earlobes are dominant. Attached earlobes are recessive. And if you can roll your tongue in a U shape, that's dominant. Okay? Weird things are controlled by our genetics. All right. So then we also have incomplete dominance, such as sickle cells, which is very common in African Americans. So you have to inherit 2 recessive genes for sickle cell anemia. And so basically both parents have to have sickle cell anemia, and then, which is thankfully recessive. So if both parents have it, the likelihood is the child will have it because they can now inherit 2 recessive genes and then they will have it. Now, if one parent has it and the other one doesn't, because it's recessive, they only get the 1 recessive gene, and then they can still have half sickle cell cells. And in this disease, instead of round blood cells, they're actually sickle shaped, or like a quarter moon, which is not good for like transporting oxygen in the blood. So they have some issues, not enough to get anemic, which is basically oxygen deficient because your blood cells aren't working. But it does give you resistance to malaria, which is great, right? Because malaria is actually what triggers sickle cell anemia in the first place. Okay. So you get some resistance without any severe anemic problems. You're a little bit more sensitive to anemia, but yeah, I hope that makes sense. If not, read it in your textbook. All right, polygenic inheritance. I mentioned this before with depression. There are multiple genes. Poly means multiple. And these genes interact in order to create whatever it is. So for depression, there are many genes controlling serotonin production, dopamine production, sensitivity to stress. I mean, I don't even know how many genes are involved in depression, but there are a lot of genes involved in it, which is basically why everybody can get depressed. Also, it talks about environmental impact. So what research has shown is that if you have one stressful event, it generally does not trigger depression, but 2 or more severely stressful traumatic events in life is enough to trigger the activation of the genes that affect serotonin and dopamine production in the brain, and now you have depression. However, there are certain genes that we know are part of this chain to getting depression, part of the polygenic inheritance, and if people don't have certain genes, then even if they go through multiple stressful events, they still don't have depression triggered. And they have to go through quite a few before other genetic pathways will trigger depression for them. So those people are more resistant to depression. It's not impossible, but they are fortunate to be resistant to it. All right, so this is a field that we call behavioral genetics, which is a field I find totally fascinating, how our genes affect our behavior, such as our genes affecting depression, your genes affecting schizophrenia, your genes affecting who you want to marry. I mean, there's all sorts of aspects to behavioral genetics, which is pretty fascinating. So it's basically estimating the influence of genes and environment on development. So how much do your genes, it's the nature-nurture question. How much of your genes, how much of the environment affect you? Happiness, for instance, we know has a correlation of about 0.5 or so, which is it's medium, but that's a pretty strong correlation to say that happiness is genetic from your parents. So basically it's 50% genetics, 50% environment, which is really amazing. So if you have happy parents, you are likely to be a happy person, unless you have something in your environment that really takes away your happiness. Twins are the primary method of studying behavioral genetics because they share the same genome. Adoption studies, and I know in Psych 101 classes you would have studied this, but adoption studies where the twins are separated at birth and then they're put into different environments, if they're still the same, like their IQ, depression, so on, then we know those things are most likely because of genetics, because they have a different environment. So if something's the same, it's probably because of genetics. So it's kind of sad, but it's really interesting. All right, so genetic potential. Two keywords here, heritability and concordance rates. So heritability is how much of something do we inherit? Is this something that is heritable, that you can inherit, such as happiness? Happiness is something that you can inherit as a gene. So how much is environment? How much is genetics? That's the concept of heritability. Going to prison, that's actually somewhat heritable. So you inherit genes for criminality from your parents. That is actually true, which has caused enormous issues in the past, such as we used to have a law saying that if you are the 3rd generation of a woman who goes to prison, then legally you can be castrated, meaning your uterus is removed. Because criminality is inherited, it's genetic, so therefore your child is going to be a criminal. So you just shouldn't have children. That was actually legal for many, many years in the United States. But the stupid thing is it's only a small, the genetics is very small. It's mostly environment. Yes, there is a genetic influence, but the gene that causes criminality is also the gene that causes people to be willing to be a cop or a firefighter or a spy or something that takes bravery. It's what we would call an antisocial gene. I don't have, it makes you not have the anxiety in a dangerous situation that most people have. So like for instance, if somebody told me I needed to rob a bank, I would be a mess. I'm never going to be a bank robber, okay? When I was a kid, and you know, every kid, I'm sure, pickpocket something from a store, it was just like, I would never do that again because it was just emotionally a mess. So I do not have that antisocial gene, or at least it's not very strong. So I would never become a criminal, at least not that type of criminal. But if you have that gene and is very strong, then you don't get any emotional reaction. You can go rob a bank and it's just fun. It's just exciting. You know, you're not worried about the cops. You're not worried about getting killed. And this is why men are much happier going to war than the majority of women, because they do have that stronger antisocial gene. So they're just not as upset about it. But again, that's only partially genetic, which is why if you join the military, you have to go through training in order to handle stressful situations. Because even though you might have that gene, for most people, it's not extreme. And so the environment still produces a sensitive or insensitive person. So if you're an antisocial person, but you're raised by parents who are really like good at getting you to understand your emotions and you know, the ramifications of your behavior, and they really get you to feel the pain of hurting another person, then that would counteract that criminality gene, okay? So again, genetics are only a part. It's not our destiny, it's only a part of who we are. Then we have concordance rates, I can't talk today. That's the percentage that indicates the degree of similarity in phenotype among pairs of family members. So heritability is the genotype, concordance rates are the phenotype. So of the expressed genes, what's the similarity amongst families? So you might want to know, what's the concordance rate with schizophrenia if your twin has schizophrenia? What's the chances of you getting it? Or if your sister has schizophrenia, or your mother has schizophrenia, or your grandfather has schizophrenia, what's the concordance rate? What's the chances that you will get it? Then we have something called the reaction range. And the reaction range, basically, it's the principle of, if you have this gene, how much of the environment influences your genetic potential. So let's say you have the gene for an IQ of 100. Your DNA says the smartest you can be is 100. Can the environment get you smarter than that? Not really. Okay, maybe a few points. It can vary it a little bit. But your DNA encapsulates your potential. Now, people don't like hearing that about intelligence, but it makes sense if I say your height. So if you have the DNA that says you can get up to 6 feet tall and no taller, then everybody goes, oh yeah, that makes sense. But the same thing happens with your IQ. Now, intelligence is complicated, so that's why I said there's some wiggle room with your genetic potential for what your IQ is. But let's just keep this simple, okay? So you have the IQ potential for 100, which is, you know, it's average. It's not dumb. It's not super smart, but it's, you know, it's average. It's fine. So if you grow up in a rich household and you have all the tutors and support you need, and your parents are loving, and you're emotionally supported, then you are going to get up to the top of your DNA potential. Okay, you will hit 100, maybe even a few extra points, and you're good. Now, you could also have a child who has an IQ potential, genetic potential of 164, which is what Einstein's IQ was. So super genius, right? That is a crazy high score for an IQ. But this kid grows up in the inner city. His parents abandon him. His grandma's raising him, and she does, I don't know, cocaine or something, and is abusive, and he goes hungry all the time, and finally he's tossed into the foster care system. What's the chances that he is going to reach his Einstein level IQ? Obviously, it's much smaller. He doesn't have the support. He may not have the physical nutrition he needs to develop his brain. He doesn't have the school. He doesn't have the tutors. You know, there's all these factors, environmental factors, that are keeping his genetic potential from reaching the top of what we call the reaction range. So the reaction range is, here's your genetic potential. Where on that genetic potential do you land based on environmental influences? And the richer, well, I shouldn't say the richer, but the more affluent you are, you know, Rich is just the amount of money you have, but affluence is the mindset, the resources, the support, and so on. So the more affluent you are, the less the environment has an impact on where you land on the reaction range, because you're going to land at the top. So it's your genetics that determines where on that reaction range you land, because you're always going to reach the top of your genetics. So the question is, what is your genetic potential if you're affluent? If you're poor, then genes don't really matter, because it's the environment that's determining where on that reaction range you land. And I've always thought that was interesting, because if you look at history in every single culture, poor people don't care about genetics. Rich people care about your genetics, your pedigree, your breeding. And that actually does make sense from a scientific standpoint, because your child's potential is determined, because you're affluent, it's determined by the genetic capabilities. It's not determined by the environment, because they already have an ideal environment, generally speaking. All right, anyhow, hope that makes sense. Not read it in your book. Okay, then we have epigenetics. Now this epigenetics is why mapping the human genome didn't mean a lot, because we discovered about 15 years ago that there is a genetic code on top of our genetics. And we call this the epigenetics, above the genome. So you have the DNA, but then you have a whole nother system that controls the expression of our DNA, epigenetics. And what controls our epigenetics? The environment. So the environment determines our epigenetics, which determines what sections of our DNA get activated. Okay, I'm gonna put a video online about epigenetics so that you can understand this better, but I find it fascinating. So basically this means that the way you live your life has an extreme effect on your DNA. We used to believe DNA was not changeable except for like radiation or something extreme like that. And you can't change your DNA, but you can change your DNA expression, and that's super powerful. Okay, so that means that you can't program your child's genetics. Well, you could program your child's genetics, but it's still the environment that determines how well those genetics get expressed. Okay. All right, so that's it for genetics. I will be posting another video about conception and prenatal development, and we'll talk about abortion and, all that good stuff. All right, so see you in the next section.